Scano so guego, Gea so gowenki se, Gangahaga Yagwai Shauda, Haudenosaunee. Greetings of peace to you. I told you my Mohawk name is Gowankyuse, and I'm Bear Clan from Six Nations, Grand River Territory, and part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I also told you my real name is Gowankyuse, which means she's visiting. And I was given that name actually as a child or in ceremony. So it's always been quite appropriate, that name that's been given to me because of the role that I've played and the work that I do now. And I want to thank first the Coast Salish peoples of this territory, and also their ancestors, whose traditional territory we sit here and thank them for that, and to be visitors in their territory. And also thanks to Link for the opportunity to present, as well as to Don Black and also to Dory, who helped me to make sure that I got here safe and sound. And also for the hospitality and for treating me and Pat really well while we're here. And before I begin my presentation, I want to also acknowledge my own ancestors, my own chiefs and clan mothers and traditional knowledge holders who have taught me what I know and what I share, and who have helped me to gain the knowledge and the strength that's been passed down from generation to generation, and has given me that historic oral traditions that have been passed down, that I have been so privileged to be raised in. And also I wanted to dedicate this presentation to two women, two Haudenosaunee women who are in the spirit world now. Tashina General is my cousin. She was a 21-year-old pregnant young woman who was murdered. She was missing first in January of 2008, and her body was found in our own community 4 months later, found in a shallow grave. And her trial, the trial for the murder, the accused, is happening as we speak. It started on November 22nd, and it's scheduled for 2 weeks. So my family is still going through that trauma. Her mother continues on a daily basis to suffer, and so that is happening. And the other is Dr. Patricia Montour. Just give me a minute. She was my Mohawk sister. She was my mentor, my big sister, my protector. She taught me a lot about having a voice. She was a full professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and she just passed away on November 17th. And she was a single mother. I spent her last days with her, helped her from the time that she got sick. And she has 3 boys, 26. One will be 20 in January, and the other is 15. And so part of my relationship with her, and because she was such a private person, was to help her through that process, and had been sharing a lot of things with her. And she was the one. I met her in 1991 when I was at the Native Law program when I first started, and she taught me how to have a voice and taught me about the confidence of that voice, to be confident about things that needed to be said, and not to be afraid of things that needed to be said. And so it was really important for me to dedicate this to both of them, and to ensure that that she's part of, and both of them will continue to be a part of the work that I do, and so that is why I need to do that for her. So the presentation I'm talking about is about restoring the balance, about what that means. So what does that mean about restoring the balance, bringing back the balance? And so our creation stories begin with our original connections to our Mother, the Earth, and the balance that we have, and those spiritual connections that we have to our Mother through many ceremonies and the acknowledgements of Thanksgiving. And so when we begin our ceremonies, we always begin with a Thanksgiving address. And that Thanksgiving address acknowledges every spiritual living thing from our Mother, the Earth, and everything that's connected to her, to the sky, everything that you can think of that's alive, and every spiritual thing. And that the only difference is that the Creator has given us a mind to think. And that's how we as human beings are different from any other spiritual living thing, is because the Creator gave us a mind. And also part of our teachings is that we have a responsibility as human beings to think 7 generations ahead. And so when we think 7 generations ahead, we have to understand the decisions that we make today has an impact on 7 generations from now. And that's the same thing my ancestors did for me, for us, in today's society and 7 generations ago. So this is actually something that captures relationships. It's about how we relate to every other living thing, about how we relate to each other as human beings, and also the ceremonies that go with it, and that there is never a forgotten moment of giving thanks to every living thing, because if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be here as human beings. And so that's part of that responsibility. And the responsibility of women, where I come from, and coming from a matrilineal society, is that women have such a huge responsibility and are very well respected for the role that they play as women, because of the responsibilities and bringing that spirit from the Creator into this world, and bringing life, bringing those future generations. And so women were so respected, not only for that, but also because of the relationship that she had with the earth and with life. And so there was a direct responsibility between our Mother, the Earth, which is why we call her our Mother, and women. And so women, in carrying and being the life givers, and the responsibilities that we have as women in carrying that life, is part of that same responsibility. So there's a same direct relationship between our Mother, the Earth, and women. And also part of what I've been taught as well is about language, and that the The language is our direct connection to our mother, the earth. So in every language, there's many different indigenous languages in this world, and so when I say that I'm Mohawk, that's not even the right word that describes me and my nation. When I said Kayangihaga, that's, you know, when it's literally translated, it means people of the flint. And so that's the direct relationship that our people have to our mother, is the transcribing or the translation of our languages. And so every nation has a language that describes them, and it usually describes their connections to the land, to our mother, the earth. And that too is about balance. That too is about that relationship between human beings and our mother, and language, and the identity of who we are as a people. And it always, and this is a universal teaching as well about when I call our traditions in our languages Guyana Srukgoa, which means, literally translated means a great big love, but it's also been called the great law of peace. And so those teachings that come about peace and respect and love and compassion, about having good relationships, about having a good mind. We have another teaching about what having a good mind means, that not only did the Creator give us a mind to think, but it also means having a good mind. And having a good mind means not only coming from your head, but also from your heart, and that you act on it, and that all of those positive relationships and that good mind, being able to transfer those things to a positive, anything that's negative into a positive, is part of the process of having a good mind, and being able to have those teachings and being able to use that in relationships. And also because women had a responsibility of carrying life, it was inherent in our teachings of being the caregivers, of being the nurturers, of being and responsible for teaching the language even to the younger generations. And also a process that everyone has a voice, that everyone has a voice. There's a process within all of our traditions that enable us to say what needs to be said. And so all of the teachings that we have is part of a bigger process, and something that has always been there historically. You can't take us away from the land. This is where our connections to our land, which is different than any other race of people, because of our connections to the land and the language and the relationships that we have. And so as a people, as a, using political words, a self-determined people, we had a way of life before the colonizers came here. So we had a balanced life. I'm not making it into a something that we never had problems, or that we never had issues that needed to be dealt with. But there was always a balanced life, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. There was a respect of all of life and the relationships that we have with life and with land. There was always a political process in being a self-determined people. There was always a political process as to how we dealt with other nations. There was always an economic process, how we traded, how we had relationships with other indigenous peoples. We had legal processes, of how we dealt with people who may have done harm to somebody else, or there was conflict in some way. There was always a process to deal with it. We had an education process. Our education process was how we lived off the land, how the elders taught us about life. So as children, we learned from our elders. That was our education system. And our social processes. We always had a process. Where I come from, we have a clan system. So when I say that I'm Bear Clan, coming from the Mohawk Nation, there was a responsibility as soon as you were born into that clan. So there was a social process of how we also develop relationships with each other. So as part of this process, in having this relationship as self-determined peoples, let's move way ahead into the impacts and colonization, and how colonization has had a direct impact, not only on our people as a whole, but also to Indigenous women specifically. And so one of the issues, again, is about this unilateral powers of government, of the federal government, when it came into existence in 1867 under the British North America Act. All of a sudden, they achieved unilateral powers to control Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Where did that power come from? Where did they get the authority to totally erase a whole people who had a system, who had a self-determined processes as people? How did they get this authority to develop these unilateral powers? And that is one of the biggest questions, because I come from a very strong sovereign people. We have continued to fight for sovereignty from day one. And I meant to bring my two-row wampum, but I've been traveling and it's at home, so I haven't been able to go home. And the two-row wampum, does everybody know what the two-row wampum is? The two-row wampum is a treaty that was made between my ancestors and the colonizers, between the Dutch, the French, the British, and then the United States. And so it established this relationship, this peaceful relationship, this friendship, this trust relationship that Gaswenta, it's called. It means a river of life. And so that on this river of life, you have one row where our canoe, it holds our laws, our culture, our beliefs, everything that you can think of that's part of our way of life. And you have the colonizer's ship, which holds their laws, their customs. And so part of that original relationship was that we would live on this river of life and not interfering in each other's business. And so as soon as Canada developed these laws, the British North America Act, then later the Indian Act, which came from, they had the power then to create legislation to then totally annihilate us as a people. Legislated genocide is what I call it. It has given them, and it violated that treaty, totally violated the two-row wampum agreements, totally violated any of the ceremonies. There would have been ceremonies that were attached to that relationship. And so it totally broke that spiritual connection. And so our people have never forgotten that. Our people have never forgotten that sovereignty and that relationship, because it's been passed down from generation to generation. So now we have this piece of legislation called the Indian Act. So it, in being this legislated genocide, It criminalized traditional ceremonies. It eliminated traditional governance. It legalized genocide through the residential school system. It created a whole foreign process of membership and registration. It created this process of what's called unstated paternity. And it also enabled the government to create a process and a department called the Department of Indian Affairs that spends all of the dollars, or most of the dollars, half of the dollars that's allocated to First Nations communities. And so you have a bureaucracy that the dollars that's supposed to go to First Nations communities, half of it is taken by the bureaucracy. You also have people who are in control, like ministers of Indian Affairs, who have no clue who our people are. And I can say that with truth, because in being in the position that I held as president of the Native Women's Association, had to meet with them. I think I had to meet with 3 during my term, and 2 different governments. So the Liberals and the Conservative governments, and having to sit and educate them about who we are as a people. So it really doesn't make any sense. But again, you have a whole government bureaucracy that doesn't make sense when it comes to our people. And so you continue to have these, the Indian Act itself being a colonial piece of legislation that still exists today, and one of the most racist pieces of legislation that exists in the world. It controls a status Indian's life from birth to after death. So as soon as you're born, when I said you have a foreign system of registration and membership, so when I say that I'm Bear Clan Mohawk Nation, that comes from my mother's side. My mother's 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 mother's. I could go right back, probably to creation story. And but I also have this little pink card from the Department of Indian Affairs that says I'm from the Cayuga Nation with no clan. But the Cayuga Nation was supposed to come from my father, right? It's supposed to be a patriarchal process, and from his father. But my father would be following his mother, who is Onondaga Turtle Clan. And his father would have been Cayuga, because that's when they would have started the registration system. So that's how it totally screwed up our clan system, and how the whole membership in coming from that patriarchal, because it was created by white men. And when I did my master's in law, at the University of Saskatchewan, and studied the impacts of the Indian Act on our culture. And during that time, before the Indian Act was actually set in place, they actually studied our people. And they studied our women. They couldn't figure out how come women had so much power. They couldn't figure out how come women had such a strong voice and made all of the decisions in the community. And how come they were so well respected. And so in order to create this whole process of annihilating us, they attacked the women first. So in order to be registered as an Indian, you were a man, and then you were either married to him or you were a child of him. So your registration was based on the male head of the household. So right from the get-go, when attacking women in the communities was its goal. And after when they found out that women were too strong, even after that. So that's when they attacked the children. Let's send them to residential school. Let's erase their memory. Let's erase their language. Let's erase their connections to land. Let's physically and sexually beat them until they don't even know who they are. And that's what they did. They did that for 5-6 generations from the time that residential school started until it ended. And so we have a whole impact of residential school that continues to this day. So as a result of all of this, it's had a direct impact on our nationhood. It has had a direct impact on our sovereignty. It has had a direct impact on our self-determination as a people. There's been a lack of acknowledgement and respect for Indigenous cultural, social, economic, and political processes and institutions. It has also created a lack of acknowledgement and respect for an Indigenous worldview and Indigenous thinking, where women have had a respected, valued, and equal role to their male counterparts, if not a higher role. As well, it created a whole process of discrimination against Indigenous women, not only in legislation, but also in policies coming from the Indian Act. This external control of membership and registration, and also practices based, again, on patriarchal values and assumptions about family and descent. So when I talked about earlier about how they're also involved in our bedrooms, because when the changes to the Indian Act was made in 1985, was called Bill C-31. And Bill C-31 was supposed to eliminate sexual discrimination, but it created more discrimination on generations. It also created a whole other process called this unstated paternity, which is the involvement of who the fathers are. And so if a woman didn't register the father, they would automatically assume that they were non-native and they would be registered lesser. So there became levels of status, right? Section 6.1 and 6.2 of the Indian Act. Then under Section 6.1 you have A, B, C, D, E. And so if a woman lost her married out, she lost her status, she lost her connection to her community and decided to marry a man who was not status. And this also applies not just to non-native men, but this applies to native men who were on the other side of the border. Another colonized process of borders that were created within our nations, within our traditional territories. So this Mohawk, for example, a Mohawk territory called Akwesasne has the US, Canada, Quebec, Ontario on its borders, New York State. So even if a Mohawk woman married a Mohawk man from the American side, she lost her status as an Indian under the Indian Act. And so that was the whole thing they created to eliminate the women's status. And so when a man could marry whomever he wanted, didn't matter what race. She became an Indian. So she became a status Indian. And so, we have brother and sister, for example, who marry out. The brother and his family and his children maintain 6.1A status under Bill C-31. The woman and her children, the mother gets 6-1C status, and her children get 6-2. So already there's a discrimination between brother and sister of how they're registered under the Indian Act. And so the sexual discrimination didn't end. And also because there's a continuing process of genealogy where you have to trace your status back to your fathers, which is the McIver case, where the process was to follow the mothers. Again, but it was very limiting with the McIver case. So this whole process of this foreign process of identity through a piece of legislation and what it's created over generations is a continuing problem. And so this unstated paternity being a continuing problem, that if a woman is in an abusive relationship or if she's raped and she has a child out of that relationship, she has to go to him and ask him for his signature for her child to be registered. You know, that's, to me, is a human rights issue, and something that will continue to be a problem until it's addressed, and until, which is what I'll end with, our own processes of self-determination. And so also what is occurring is internalized oppression within our own communities, and how the processes of colonization has also had an impact in our own communities, and the violence that's occurring, that cycle of violence as a result of residential school. You know, I asked our old people about the language, and I asked if there was a word for rape. I asked if there was a word for sexual assault. So our languages are old. And they said there wasn't a word for rape. There wasn't a word, there's a word for assault. There's a word for beating somebody up. But there isn't a word for sexually beating somebody up. So when you think about the language and the history of the language, it's a new word. They said they would have to create a new word for that. So if it's a new word, then obviously it didn't exist before. And so that's, you know, when you think about the language and doing research on the language, it's important to understand how that connection is made. And so where did that violence come from? Where did that cycle of violence? It came with colonization. It came with that residential school system. And so that's part of the healing, is understanding that. And part of that internalized oppression and what's happening even in our own communities is also a part of a healing process, which is, I'll get to that at the end. So you have these Eurocentric attitudes and assumptions and beliefs that are based on these patriarchal norms that have negatively affected Indigenous women around the world, and also about how it had an impact on their role in family and community, and about eliminating their knowledge and expertise and wisdom within the governance processes, within the environment, within decision making. And this issue of violence itself, you know, the statistics are that Aboriginal women are 3 times more likely to experience violence, and Aboriginal women between the age 35 to 44 are 5 times more likely to die from acts of violence than non-Aboriginal women. And I'm a product of a survivor of violence. I was violated when I was 3 years old by my own grandfather. Molested, And then when I became a teenager, and even before that, I was violated by another family member. And so that's what I thought. That's how I thought we were supposed to be treated. And so I ended up in really violent relationships. And so that's how you begin to think that that's how you're supposed to be treated. And so it wasn't until I started my own healing process and understanding that that isn't the way it's supposed to be at all. In fact, we have teachings, which is what I had to relearn, about relationships. Everything that I talked about when I first started about relationships and the respect of women. So those were the things that our own communities need to relearn. The teachings are still there. The elders are still there to teach them. The knowledge holders. The people who can teach us about what those teachings are and about that relationship, that sacred relationship we have with another human being. And in talking further about violence, we have women were violated from day one. You know, it's not a new thing. Women were violated, marginalized, displaced from their own communities as a result of the Indian Act. Forced displacement from their own community. Racialized and sexualized violence, where women are direct targets of violence because of their race and because of their gender. So that's the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And the disappearance and death. And that colonialism, colonization is directly linked to racialized and sexualized violence that leads to death and disappearance. And when I first started to work with Amnesty International and helping to write the first draft of the Stolen Sisters report and doing the research and meeting with families across the country, those that were suffering, traumatized from someone in their life who was either missing or found murdered. That was the first time that anybody had ever talked to them about it, and they were always feeling alone, always isolated. And so I started this work at least 8 years ago now, working with families of the missing and murdered and the trauma that they continue to have on a daily basis. And then working with the Native Women's Association of Canada and the Sisters in Spirit initiative, and the initiative in the research, the policy, the education, the public information, addressing the high numbers of missing. When we first started, we had an anecdotal number of 500. And so the anecdotal of 500 became a fact. Through the database. And I believe it's up to at least, I think it's 600 and something now. But that was, again, part of that process in creating an initiative to obtain what we already knew. And in fact, I believe it's a lot higher, thousands, because some families are not even reporting. Either they're not reporting or not able to access them or the information. So part of that process was also to understand the root causes and to identify measures to increase safety and well-being. And as I was going through this process was when I had to go through it in my own family. And so after we buried Tashina 2 years ago. In 2008, I met with the Minister of Justice probably about 2 weeks after we buried her, and I was really angry. Really angry. I think I was so angry I don't even remember what I said. But I just remember the look on his face across the table when his eyes became about this big. When I told him that I had to deal with that personally now. And that, when I was working with families, when I first started, I related to them on the violence issue because I understood what it was like to be in a violent relationship. And they'd ask me, like, why would they go back? Why would they go back to someone who's abusing them and violating them? And so I tell them my experiences. Well, you don't know. You don't even know that you're not supposed to be treated any differently. So I had that relationship with them, being able to build that trust with them. But then after this happened with my cousin, I became too angry. And also because there were so many other issues that I was dealing with, other than the missing and murdered women, it became very traumatizing. To hear from women on a daily basis, either they were abused, they were kicked out of their house, they had nowhere to live, they had no health services, or they were trying to get health services, they were trying to get in school, they were trying to get a lawyer to help them, and they never had help. And so it was a really difficult process to go through. And when Aboriginal women's organizations are not funded, and there's no financial resources to try to help, it creates another layer of trauma. Because you don't have the resources to try to help every individual woman who needs help. And when you hear about this on a daily basis, so I meet with families, meet with women, and I'm sitting at these political tables and telling them about the impacts that this has on women and their families. At this other political level with premiers and the Prime Minister, and trying to tell them that I hear from these women on a daily basis, and what are you going to do about it? Because you are part of the problem. You created this. You created this impacts of colonization on Indigenous women in this country. It's the same thing that happened with the apology. You can apologize, an abuser can apologize to you, but they can kick you at the same time, which is what this government is still doing. Even though they've apologized, they're still kicking us. They're still trying to annihilate us and eliminate us as a people. We're in the way of economic development. We're in the way of mining, of oil and gas development. So let's figure out a way to totally annihilate these people. Colonization hasn't ended. So you have, all of these things that are happening to Indigenous women, but then you have grassroots people who also try to bring to the public's attention. So here you have the Memorial March, to bring attention to the public about the women who went missing from the downtown east side. You have the Walk for Justice. You have Highway of Tears. You have grassroots organizations who are trying to bring attention not just to the missing women, but to any issue. And so in trying to create these processes, it's the grassroots people that are going to make the changes. because they don't need money to do it. And that's where the changes are going to happen. Because government isn't going to give us money to make the changes that we want to see. That was supposed to be for the end. There's another issue called matrimonial real property. Matrimonial real property is a piece of legislation that's supposed to address the issues of housing on reserve. So you have this issue, so usually what happens, right, when you divorce or separated off reserve, for those of you who may have gone through it, you have a division of assets. So if you have a home that you own off reserve, the division of assets are put into a whole statement, financial statement, and your home is included in that. But if you live on reserve, the house isn't included. It was a Supreme Court of Canada ruling that a house on reserve is not included in a division of assets. So if a woman has been married to someone on reserve for 20, 30 years, she puts her whole life into the home, and they split. Violent relationship maybe. She has children. She's the one who has to leave, usually, with her kids. So she has to find either somewhere with her family to move into, which is already overcrowded. The housing on reserve is nothing. So there's no house on the reserve to move to. So she may have to move to an urban setting. Already maybe living in poverty with her kids, so then she has to live in the most poverty-stricken areas in the city to survive. So again, it's a human rights issue for women, this issue of matrimonial real property, because it has, it's a whole spousal issue. It could be a man, but it's mostly women and her kids who are being impacted as a result of matrimonial real property. Even housing policies on reserve favor the house going to the man, the male. That's a whole, in my master's in law thesis, I called it Eurocentric diffusionism, where our way of thinking has been impacted by Eurocentric patriarchal values, so much so that we forgot about our own. Because if our own communities were thinking about our own, they wouldn't be kicking women and children out of the home. There'd be total respect for her and her children and future generations. Be trying to find a way for families to stay together. There's a whole process again, and these negative consequences for women and children. The negative effects on women. It even impacts, they may not even have separated if a husband passed away. Even if a husband passed away, she doesn't have access to her home. Or she could be, again, because of the Indian Act and the impacts of the Indian Act, if she was from another community and she was married into another one, his community, she was registered under his community. So she would no longer, because she was coming from another community, they may decide, well, you're not part of this community. So it becomes a whole another issue of that internalized oppression, Eurocentric diffusionism. Another issue is federally and provincially sentenced Aboriginal women. Aboriginal women are overrepresented in the Canadian correctional system. I think in the prairie provinces, I would say probably 80 to 95% of the women in prison are Aboriginal women. They also do not have adequate programs or services due to lower funding that's compared to men in prisons. So they have lesser services even inside the prison system. Also what happens is that they're more likely to be classified as maximum security prisoners. So, and they also serve longer sentences. So if a woman who, let's say she serves federal time, which means more than 2 years, if she serves in a federal prison and she's angry, anybody be angry to be inside one of those places, and controlled, she ends up, let's say she got 3-year sentence, she ends up with a 20-year sentence. And also the way the classification process is with corrections is either your minimum, medium, or maximum security. A lot of those women, Aboriginal women, are serving their time as maximum security prisoners. And you can only go through healing programs if you're a minimum security. So again, there's a whole internalized process inside. And I'm sure many of you, if you haven't, know about the suicides in Kingston. And the suicides that occurred at the Kingston prison for women, and why it was shut down was because of the suicides, and they didn't have services for those women inside. And also because it was the only maximum security prison. And so women who were from the West had to go to Kingston. So they were also geographically away from their children or their families, which had an impact on them. So, I mean, these are, I can go on and on. I can talk about health statistics. I can talk about the barriers, the socioeconomic barriers to Aboriginal women, specifically health, education. You know, the statistics are horrible when it comes to Aboriginal women. But I'm going to stop there because those are all of the negative impacts. And I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to spin it now to the positive. And the positive is the fact that I'm up here standing, telling you about it. And the fact that our people have been so resilient, and our women have been so resilient to 500 or more years of impacts of colonization. I have been privileged to be raised in a traditional, despite all of the negativity. I have been raised in a community where our teachings are really strong. And despite everything that has happened, which is why I say I'm up here, I can stand here and say that as an Ongwahome, as a Haudenosaunee woman, and the strength that our women have to be able to maintain our culture. Because now, today, we have to teach our men how to be men, how to be real warriors. That was always the responsibility of women. But it was the balance, because the men respected them so much. And so the men became the role models. Men became the teachers, but it was the women who taught them how to be that way. So when I talk about resilience, and I talk about revitalization, and about how our traditions and our cultures and our teachings are revitalized, when I talked about the impacts of violence, and the only way that I was able to get past that and how it had an impact on me was through ceremony, through healing ceremonies, and going back to the older women again in my community who had that knowledge about relationships and about our teachings, about family, about the clan system. And that there are teachings that are taught as soon as you're born about those relationships. And there's different teachings as you get older. And so the residential school system, I'm going to swear because I feel like it really fucked us up. I don't usually, but I'm going to blame that one on Trish. And when I say that the residential school has had a direct impact on that, on those teachings, because when we became women, there were celebrations, ceremonial celebrations of becoming a woman and becoming a man. And that's when your teachings are there about how to be a good woman and how to be a good man. That was totally erased in residential school. It became a bad thing. It became a bad thing to become a woman. It became a bad thing to become a young man. And beaten for it. And so all of those teachings, when you think of how many generations that has had on our relationships, because you would have been taught by your elders about those relationships. So again, it's about reclaiming our tradition. It's about reclaiming our culture, about reclaiming our teachings, and about how we have survived everything that has happened to us. So these strengths that we have as a people, as a nation, as a culture, is what has maintained who we are and the knowledge that we hold. And so this awareness of who we are. So you have an awareness of yourself. Self-determination comes from self first. So when you know yourself, when I say I'm a Mohawk Bear Clan as an individual, I know who I am. And so as an individual, I come from a bigger clan system, bigger nation, and a bigger community. And so that's how much we need to relearn and reclaim our teachings. And it's about healing. So that's the process that we're in now, is healing. Is having an understanding of what I told you. A lot of our own people don't even know. And what I'm telling you, a lot of our own people aren't even at that place yet. You know, the addictions, drugs, alcohol, violence in our communities, that cycle that's occurring in our communities, and the violence that is occurring between people, that is an impact of residential school. And so that healing that has to occur. When I said at the apology, you know, about, okay, well, what are you going to do about it now? You know, you can apologize, you can say things, but it's about actions. It's about acting on it. It's about acting on having that good mind, about acting on how things need to change, about acting and healing, the actual process of healing. It's a continuous process from until you die. Now, because I understand that, you know, I understand the process of healing is going to take a lifetime. So the numbers of years, the number of generations that has had an impact on today, it's going to take that long for us to come back. Which is what I say, that whole cycle. You know, in our culture, we talk about cycles. Everything always comes back around. Everything always comes back to where it started from. And so when you talk about how things, if that's how it is supposed to be, this whole cycle that we're coming through is going to end up back to where we came from. And I think that's what everybody's searching for is what is that? What's the truth? Where do I come from? What is my spirit telling me where I come from? And how do I maintain and understand and continue that process for future generations? Which is what I started from the beginning, is if I make a decision today, if I as an individual make a decision today, how is it going to impact future generations? I'm a grandmother now. I have 4 grandkids, 9, 7, 2, and 6 months. And so I know that those future generations are coming. My little granddaughter, Tessa, who's 7, is a seer. She already knows how many children she's going to have. She already knows how many children her brother is going to have. So we know that cycle continues. So I have to decide. I have to make the decision. We have to make the conscious choices. The conscious choices, the Creator gave us that mind to think about how things are going to be in 7 generations from now. How do we relate to each other? How do we make things better? How do we ensure that our relationship to the earth is going to be good for 7 generations from now? How do we make sure they have water? How to make sure that they have land to grow food on? How can we make sure that the ceremonies are done to ensure and to give thanks for that? So how we choose to do that is very critical. How we choose to live our life today is very critical. And so we really need to dig into the reality, to dig into those actions that need to occur. And sometimes we have to deal with really uncomfortable issues. Sometimes we have to talk about that uncomfortableness, about the impacts of colonization. Sometimes we have to deal with the guilt or the shame of things that happened in the past. But as long as we deal with it, as long as we deal with the changes that have to occur to make things better. And we also have to have respect for people who have had those direct experiences. Also to act on their experiences. And to be proactive, to make those positive changes. Because that's what it's about. I mean, I can talk and talk and talk. All of us can talk and say the words and have the voice, but it's about action. It's about how we actually do the work and how we actually make the changes to make things better for everyone, all human beings in today's society and for the future. So I'm going to leave it there. And I'm hoping you'll have lots of questions. I don't even know what time it is. I've just been talking. And sometimes I can, I can talk sometimes for too long. When I found my voice, now you can't shut me up. So, what time is it? Pardon? 8:20? Okay. We're supposed to be done at 9? Okay. So that leaves us some good time for you to ask me questions.
Are you aware of any initiatives to go on the road with this discussion throughout the community?
Well, that's one thing. I really didn't get into the actual community-based. There are a lot of communities who are doing the work, the healing work. There's not enough. But again, I mean, a big part of it is about resources. I mean, that's the reality in today's society is how do we ensure language programs, because that's part of the healing. But that's also part of what I said to the government. If you want to act on your apology, then stop cutting language programs, because that's what they did. They cut the funding for language programs. And the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, they cut the funding to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. That was a big part of people's healing from residential school. You have the TRC that's happening, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I don't know, I don't see healing coming out of that, really. It's people who are still traumatized, and I think still being victimized through another government process. But the work, I mean, the people who are able to do it and who are committed to do the work of healing, of understanding what I've told you is happening, but it's happening very slowly. And a big part of it as well is part of that healing is the men. The leaders in where I come from even, we have our traditional, I never really got into detail about even our traditional governance system, and the chiefs in our community are created by the women, but that Eurocentric diffusionism has affected our own men, our own chiefs as well. And so there's still a lot of that control issues in the community, that internalized oppression. And so the women in the communities are trying to revitalize, trying to reclaim, and so they're doing it in little pockets all over the place. And so when the confidence is built, and when they feel that it's comfortable and safe for those voices to be heard, will happen. And I think that's where the shift is happening, because it's happening at a really low level. But as soon as that shift occurs, it's just going to naturally occur. And then look out.
Yeah. Beverley, thank you for your talk. That was a pleasure. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on the urban Aboriginal population. And you talked a lot about the historical, about the history, and just the impact within the development of an urban Aboriginal population.
Okay. Yep, I mean, I think the population in urban centers is at least 50% now. On reserve and off reserve. But actually what I've seen in my experience is that people in urban centers are actually learning more about their identity than they are off reserve, because of the services that are being provided by friendship centers across the country. And I think that's part of also what has to happen in Indigenous people in urban centers is taking that responsibility. It's about self again. It's about self-determination, about knowing where they come from, because that's what has to occur, is knowing where they come from in an urban center. And when I talked about women who have been impacted, and mostly women who are having to move to urban centers to raise their families, a big part of that are the strength of the women who are teaching their children who they are and where they come from, and maintaining that spiritual relationship. In some communities, there are a lot of differences in how to make the connections between, because some people are leaving either for good reasons, to go to school, to work, some leaving for bad reasons because there is no home on reserve, or for violence as a result of violence. And so part of that bigger connection is also the relationship to the land. And so in the connections to the land, again, establishes that identity. And language, again, is a big part of that. Because of the impacts of residential school, the language is the connection. And so you have to be able to directly connect with people who speak the language, and the teachings and the ceremonies, because that's what builds that spiritual strength.
When you mentioned that disparity between prison sentences, were you comparing women to Native men or non-Native women?
You mean with the...
being more likely to receive maximum security?
No, it's just a statistic. Yeah, it's a statistic of the numbers of women who are in prison, not just the numbers of women who are in prison, but also the women who are in prison, the numbers that are serving all these different security assessments, because it's the assessments that they have to go through internally with corrections.
Thank you, Beverley. I especially appreciate you speaking in light of Patricia Montague's essay.
Yeah.
So my question is around your notions of healing, and whether you could comment on whether the treaty process is part of that process of healing.
You mean here in I don't know if I can speak to that issue directly, because I think that's that is a specific nation. I can't speak on behalf of somebody else's nation. I can speak on behalf of my own, and on behalf of where I come from. So I don't want to disrespect them. What I will talk about, though, is about government and the treaty relationship historically, and the fact that when treaties were established historically, the numbered treaties, even pre-Confederation treaties, government has never implemented treaty principles. They've never implemented the fact that they are treaties. They've never implemented the nation-to-nation sovereign relationships. They've never acknowledged internationally that treaties were nation-to-nation relationships. And so I question, if they aren't able to do that historically with past treaties, how can they do that today without acknowledging that relationship? And with treaties, when the Indian Act system came into place, there were treaties that were already established. And they were supposed to be part of the Indian Act system and acknowledging traditional lands from the treaties. Some of the treaties historically were created under duress. And so if you have those historic treaties and treaties that were created under duress, how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with interpretations? How do you deal with interpretations of treaties when their indigenous peoples are interpreting them according to the language, and the government is interpreting treaties according to the English language and can manipulate the English language? They can manipulate words, they can change words into meaning something else. You can't do that with indigenous languages. When you say something that means something, you can't change it. You can't interpret it any other way. And so that whole way of thinking about that treaty relationship, already they clash. So, you know, there's a lot of questions about even historical treaties.
I have a question. I'm not quite sure if I fully formed it in my head yet, but for the generation or two that were post-residential school, life in 2010, 2011 is very complicated dealing with that relationship now. So as a non-Aboriginal person, how, from your perspective, what does that relationship look like? I mean, from what I see in First Nations communities, this is going to sound very commercialized and stereotypical, but there's always opportunities for craft shows and art fairs and lectures and things like this, but the real life day-to-day, like what does that relationship look like now?
Well, I'm a product of that, and being a second generation, my grandmother being in residential school. So I can respond to you by telling you how the differences in how my grandmother's family, so all my mom's siblings, so they all married off. They all married non-native. They didn't know, they have never known about their culture. My grandmother refused to be Mohawk when leaving the residential school. She was a fluent Mohawk language speaker. The only reason why my mom was raised by her grandmother, so she was the only one of her siblings that married a traditional man. And so I can see the direct impacts from my dad's family and my mom's family when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to Indigenous knowledge. But I can also see the impacts even on my dad's side of the family and the impacts of violence. And so when you're dealing with generational issues, and let's say, for example, my daughter, I raised her to understand who we are. I also raised her to understand, and she was in immersion language school in the community. But she had a difficult time because I didn't speak the language at home. So she'd go to school, learn the language, then come home and speak English, which is totally opposite of how it was from residential school. And so, in causing it, it's creating confusion. And so the younger generations, you also have a difference between the young people who are really strong in understanding their culture and wanting to learn their culture and tradition. But then you have the other side of it where they don't want anything to do with it. They don't think it has an impact on their life whatsoever. And so you have these two, I always think of the two-row because that's exactly how it is. So part of that, to me, part of what needs to occur is, in our culture, it's called a condolence. It's a whole ceremony of healing, and it has to occur to all generations. So this condolence, this healing that has to happen is a whole process of understanding the reasons why things are the way they are today. So everything, that I've said in just a little bit of time is also what they need to understand, and the reasons why they're going through what they're going through. We have so many suicides that are happening, addictions and accidents and all these things that are happening to the young people, the younger generations. But we also have, we also have angry elders and elders who are following the traditional way. And so sometimes angry elders are teaching and sending the wrong messages. So when I'm saying that process of condolence or healing has to happen in every generation, and that's part of that teaching that has to occur, because our languages aren't lost. We still have the language. I think there's some in Mohawk culture, Mohawk language is probably one of them that's going into extinction, but we still have the language speakers. I think in every nation across in the world still has indigenous languages. I'll always go back to language because that's our identity and where we come from. So part of that again is about healing. When you're talking about how do we do it, but it's also not only our responsibility as Indigenous people to heal. There was other parties to those treaties. Non-Indigenous descendants of treaties. All of us are part of that treaty relationship. So it isn't just us as Indigenous people who have to heal, it's also the non-Indigenous people that have to heal. And in fact, I would say non-Indigenous people have to heal even more than we do, because we only have 500 years. For non-Indigenous people, it's longer than that. A lot longer. And so, to me, that's also part of that healing process. Also has to happen on both sides. And also an understanding of why things are happening the way they are on both sides. And so that, to me, is part of healing. And part of that reconciliation that has to occur. And racism. Those stereotypes that still occur in today's society. When I talk about the uncomfortableness of that has to be dealt with. Because our young people are committing suicide because of it. And so that is another issue that needs to be addressed. And I can say that because I know that Trisha's daughter, who was only 16, committed suicide. And it was partially because of racism and what she had to deal with, and the bullying, the violence. Yeah.
Thanks. You spoke just very briefly, you had mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you just mentioned reconciliation now. Since the 1990s, the whole industry has emerged around the idea of reconciliation and kind of pushing that agenda. I was wondering, in your role as a leader and in your travels and talking to people around the ecology and these sorts of issues which have that ultimate sort of framework in mind, if you come across much narratives among our communities or community members who aren't ready to reconcile yet, they're still in a position of refusing to accept an apology that is bullshit, or refusing to forgive for acts that are still ongoing. Mm-hmm. Forgiveness assuming that something has stopped. And then do you see that kind of thrust to not forgive, to refuse reconciliation as an equally legitimate expression in somebody's to somebody's healing process, as to a rush to a premature sort of reconciliation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. There are a lot of people who are angry, and they have a right to be angry. Anger is an emotion that sometimes is thought of as a negative one. But anger, I'm angry. I'm angry at all the shit that's happening to our people across the women around the world. But it's how you direct your anger. It's how you make your anger into something positive. There are people who are angry who are still abusive. And so part of that process is of healing is understanding what that means. It may be different for every individual person. And it may take time. Time was always something in our culture that has never been defined. Not like time on a clock, a year, a day. So healing in that process takes time. And so if somebody's not willing to accept or to even to change their life, they have a right to do that. Every individual has a right to be who they are and what they want to be. But if they're caught in that cycle of violence, then there's a process that does need to occur. Because it's the violence that has to stop. And I don't mean violence to others, I mean to themselves. So if somebody is still hurting, is still in pain, is still suffering, most of the time it's because they've never felt love. Which is a big part of our tradition and our culture where I come from, and I think most Indigenous cultures have a teaching about love and about relationships and about how you treat people. And so if an individual person is still very angry and not willing to change, most of the time it's because they just need to be heard and to have a voice. Because most times people who are also in that place don't want to speak, or they don't want to say anything. And so a big part of it is, to me as well, is about finding their voice. Because in most cases, as an oppressed people, also feeling that they're not worthy to have a voice. And so sometimes it's that worthiness as a people, as a person, to be able to have that voice. But there are still a lot of, like you said, there's still a lot of people who are not willing to accept the apology. They don't have to. They don't have to accept the apology. I mean, that was one thing that I did before the apology, was I spoke to people in my own community about the apology and, tried to get some advice about what I should say. And the people, and I asked whether they were going to participate, and some of them said, it means nothing to me. It means nothing to me because they continue to colonize. And so, like I said, people have a right to feel how they're feeling. if there's a process, and that's what I was, in talking about this condolence ceremony, that's part of having a voice. And I think that's important. But it's when it becomes violent is when I worry. Not to others, but to themselves, and whether they're hurting themselves. Then that's when intervention needs to happen, and people need to surround them with love.
Hi, my name is Jessie. I'm from Yellowknife. I have a question about the young men in our communities, in every Native community, really. I see a lot of them suffer, suffering from unemployment, poverty, low self-esteem, addictions, and whatnot. They have no visible role models. In time, they will. I'm sure eventually there will be mentorship programs set up, or culture camps, whatever, but that takes time and resources and money. And for the immediate problem, right now, like all the suffering that they're going through, that we're going through as a community, I'm just wondering how we as women can effectively communicate with them, how we can maintain gentleness but assertiveness at the same time. It's a very tricky thing to do, and we need to tell them what we need from them to live right as a community, what we need from them as males. And a lot of the times I find, they can dismiss us as being preachy or just avoiding it, not even wanting to go there. And I don't know, I just find it a little bit challenging and overwhelming, how to get through to them. If we just offering what it is, it's like friendly advice, from your heart, and they don't take it that way because we're female and they forget how they're supposed to treat us, which is unfortunate. So I'm just wondering how to effectively communicate with them and be patient and everything. Yeah.
Well, I think you've already said it. One of them is to be patient, because in that healing process, when I said everybody needs to, the young people, and both male and female, part of that process in healing and the impacts, and you're totally right, is our men. Women, I think, are healing a lot faster than the men are. And so it is difficult to have role models for our young men, because the older men are either out drinking, leaving their families, addictions, and so finding that role model is really difficult for the young men. And so gangs is occurring as well in our communities. And so I think a big part of that is also the impacts on our families and our clan systems. Because it was family that is what was strengthened us as a people. It wasn't just as an individual, because our families are the ones who helped us to maintain our connections and with each other, and to build that strength amongst families and clans and nations. And so that is a major issue with the young men. But I can also say that there are a lot of young men who are strong. And so I think a big part of that is building a process to be able to bring those younger, strong men, young warriors, real warriors, to together. And the women have a responsibility to say, I need you to do that. I need you, the young men who know who they are and where they come from and what they're doing and their role models. You know, you don't need, we're talking about resources and services and programs that could be developed. I do know that there are some that exist. I know in Ontario, there is a program called I Am a Kind Man, and it is bringing the role models of the men and the teachings of the men and that balance and teachings to the young men, which does have to happen. And I know that it's going to take time, patience. That's all I can say, because those who are aware, those who know and see the bigger picture, because that's where I see the women can see the bigger picture, is having that patience. Even with people with addictions, even people who are angry, even people who don't want to heal, who are not on the same level, is being patient and knowing why. Also knowing why things are happening the way they are. That's my advice. You already know. Yeah. One more.
I just have a really quick question. It's about the Sisters in Spirit initiative. I heard rumblings that the federal government, about the name of it, that you weren't able to use the name anymore. Could you just let us know what's going on with that?
Well, I haven't been involved with the Native Women's Association of Canada since September of 2009. So I did my job, and so I've left it in the hands of the new president and the board of directors and the staff. And so I know what you know that's in the media. I do know that the federal government had announced $10 million in their federal budget, but they're giving themselves the money. They're giving themselves the money to the RCMP, to different programs within the government, to the status of women. And so now that the money is with the federal government, it will become a money grab again for organizations to fight for that money. So that's what I see happening. Again, government has a really good process of divide and conquer. And until our people start to understand that that's what they're doing and trying to come together to unify and understand that that is exactly what they're doing, only until that time. And I can see, the grassroots. When Sisters in Spirit initiative first started, it was based on the family's needs. And the research and the policy was another big part of it. And what I saw was that the family's needs weren't being met. And then it became a bigger, it just spread because it was the communities, it was grassroots that was connected to the families, and it was the families that started to come together. And so it's become a bigger, broader issue than just what's happening in Ottawa. And so to me, it is that what I said earlier about government controlling the dollars, that it needs to be the grassroots that's going to make the changes. Whether or not the Sisters in Spirit initiative through the Native Women's Association of Canada exists, that Sisters in Spirit belongs to the families. The mask that was created by Dick Baker here in this territory, he created it for the families. And so the logo that came from the mask, I believe, still belongs to the families. And the families are not giving up. They're not going to give up the fight to bring justice to their own loved ones. And I also can see over the 8 years that I've been working with families, the strength that they also have gained in reclaiming their voice to address it. So government can do whatever they want. It's not going to change things that it's going to happen on the ground and to the families. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.